Because people believed that fairies controlled their fate as their neighbors, people frequently thought about how they might ingratiate themselves to the fairies and their kin, while worrying about how they might offend them. Early Anglo-Saxon doctors would not only try to cure diseases, they would try to figure out how the sick person might have offended the fairies, and what they might do to make up for it. It would be nearly impossible to come up with a complete list of every trait the fairies could potentially have. That said, there are a number of traits that most, though not necessarily all fairies have. I have visualized these traits in a wheel because there isn't always a clear dividing line between them. Rather, there's a sort of continuity between the common traits fairies exhibit. Joyous, artistic. Music and dancing are the fairies' delight, as Jacob Grimm notes in his book. The fairies were most often seen when they were dancing atop hills or feasting within them. They were great lovers of beauty, art, and joy, and it wasn't uncommon for people to encounter them when the fairies were seeking to hire musicians. People often longed to dwell among the fairies, with their feasts and their joy, for they would turn somersaults as they ran, laugh loudly, and act whimsically. Vanishing, sorrowful. Yet there is also a sorrow that marks the fairies, as has been noted repeatedly. Fairies, it seems, are always in the process of vanishing. Since the medieval era, people have written that fairies are vanishing and leaving their homeland, becoming refugees. There are many stories of fairies asking people to take them away on boats, of them sadly leaving the lands they once loved. Sadder are the stories of them fading away, for fairies are dreamlike beings, and while dreams can be joyful, they are also effervescent, and can vanish like a bubble on the wind at any moment. The pixies of southwest England and Cornwall are said to be shrinking every time they use magic, until, eventually, they will disappear entirely. This vanishing might explain why fairies sometimes seem sorrowful in their joy. In medieval literature, fairies could appear to celebrate without cause, going through the motions of joy without ever actually experiencing happiness. Dreamlike. Many people encountered the fairies in their dreams. When a witch would visit fairyland, they didn't simply fly off to dance with the fairies and present themselves to the fairy king and queen. Rather, they would lay down and enter a catatonic-like state so that their soul could leave their body. People would visit the fairies and their kin during near-death experiences or at similar times. The fairy world is described as an immaterial place. Further, testimonies gathered from Celtic peasants go on to attest that spirits and fairies exist all around us, invisible. Many fairies shift form freely, appearing as a cup, an animal, a tree. Illusionary. Nothing is what it seems in the world of fairy. Castles turn out to be dark caverns, and caverns turn out to be bright palaces. Fairies are, in and of themselves, mutable beings, always changing form and type. When a fairy pays a human for services rendered, the enigmatic creatures, never satisfied with simply paying them in money, instead pay humans with dead horses, dried leaves, twigs, and other seemingly useless items which turn to gold, should the person be smart enough to bring it home. Liminal. Perhaps the most enigmatic fairy trait, fairies are the lords of liminal states, the transitional periods when one thing becomes another, such as twilight, when day becomes night, and the cusp of adulthood, when the child becomes an adult. Every society has liminal periods, times when things are changing from one to another, peace to war, war to peace, harvest time, springtime, planting. But danger lies in transitional states, simply because transition is neither one state nor the next. It is undefinable. The person who must pass from one to another is himself in danger and emanates danger to the others. The danger is controlled by ritual. Fairies, then, might be thought of as earthly divinities, which help to maintain control during transitional states. This meant that they could be cruel or kind, for any transition could turn out to be good or bad. Human reflection. The fairies' dreamlike and liminal nature, mixed with the fact that they are folk religious figures, meant that they had a tendency to reflect human society, or perhaps it's better to say that humans reflected fairy society. It was the fairies, like the nymphs, who taught humans how to be moral, how to live, farm, and more. In Italian lore, there was a fairy tale in which the fairy was the one who taught cheese making. It shouldn't be surprising that the fairies often lived much as humans do, with laborers, nobility, kings, and queens. Indeed, it is often difficult to tell when a human has entered fairyland, and many memories begin with people not realizing the people they just encountered are in fact fairies. Folk religious figures. An English woman clutches her feverish child close as she runs up the side of a hill. Just a few hundred feet from her village is a rock with a hole in it. This rock is home to a hob she hopes will cure her child's illness. Fairies were a major part of many people's folk religions. That is, the beliefs people held that were outside those held by the elite leaders and scholars of a society. Women in Joan of Arc's village would drink water from a fairy pool when they were sick in hopes of getting better. People would ask the fairies for help with their harvest and other concerns. There are many charms specifically designed to draw on the power of fairies. Of course, depending on the era, fairies and their kin could be central to people's primary religion. Among the Uralic people, the local divinities and spirits were the ones who people prayed to first and most often, for they had been appointed to look after the world by the high gods. In ancient Greece, people frequently prayed to the nymphs first, damped their local nymphs on the city's money, and sang their love for the nymphs. On the other hand, in Dartmoor, among other places, the fairies, like pixies, weren't so much worshipped as they were treated as invisible neighbors, people who trade magical help for material objects from them, not out of a sense of reverence, but because the pixies were their neighbors. Wise. In fairy tales, one of the most common roles for fairies was that of wise advisor. They and their kin were the ones who taught witches their magic in most European countries and were asked to help divine people's futures. Moral. Fairies didn't avoid lying because they couldn't lie, but because lying was morally reprehensible to them. Nymphs had people stung by bees for using bad words. Fairies beat men who hit their wives, and villagers were buried under avalanches for being cruel to beggars in the Alps. Fairies hated greed, laziness, and bad hosting etiquette. There are even stories of them slicing and cooking up old misers, then bringing them back to life so they could do it again and again for eternity. Indeed, it is probable that many of the beings considered fairies were rulers of the pre-Christian hells. Conservative. Fairies didn't like change or dirtiness. Cut down certain trees and they were liable to curse you with death. Give them new foods and it might chase them away, just as something they'd never seen before would force them to make a comment and often run off. For fairies were stuck in the past and often wore old-fashioned clothing, and their ruling court was more a reflection of the human government from hundreds of years before. Ancient. Fairies can live for thousands of years, and some might live forever. This not only makes them more conservative and grounded in the past, it can also make them act like grandparents of humanity, or at the very least, like the older couple that hangs people's pictures on their fridges and sends money to the graduations of children who they don't really know. For the fairies are connected to everyone in the region, one way or another. They watch them and often feel for them. Thus, many fairies will become the godparents of the people in a region, which likely explains why Cinderella's godmother was a fairy. Childish. As ancient beings who love artistry and joy, the fairies can often act childish, in both good and bad ways. They might spring into a somersault or play with children. On the other hand, when offended, they can throw a tantrum like a child with magical powers would. Extreme emotions. Everything about fairies is centered on the fact that they appear to feel emotions much more intensely than humans do. When a human gives them the tiniest amount of help, they reward the human with lifelong happiness, gold, and some other incredibly precious gift. However, should the human even do the slightest amount of harm to the fairy, death is often the punishment. We see this repeatedly in fairy tales. In the Edda, a Norn trips and hurts herself as she is getting up to give a child its fate, and in her rage, she curses the child to die. This is similar to Sleeping Beauty, in which the fairy, who was overlooked by the child's parents, curses the child with death. Duality. A consequence of the fact that fairies can transform themselves and the fact that they have extreme emotions is that fairies seem to actually change form to fit their mood. House fairies from Wales can actually change into a monster, altering the way they look as they begin to torment those in the houses of the community around them. Even Yeats claimed that leprechauns could turn into flesh-eating monsters under the right circumstances. This makes sense given that fairies are forces of nature, and nature itself was a fickle thing. The same river that might help you one moment could drown you the next. Dependent on humans. In one Irish story, a fairy queen is dying for need of human milk. In many more, fairy children are sickly until they get some human food. Fairies, it seems, depended on human food. There was something in the magic of human hands preparing and gathering something that gave them a nutrition they couldn't get any other way. Further, many fairies couldn't repair or make mundane objects without human help. Yeats stated that in wars between fairy clans, the side with the human would win. Even the god Odin and the Greek Olympians needed humans to help them fight some battles, for the giants couldn't be defeated in Greek lore unless a human struck them. Afraid of humans, often feared humans, just as humans feared them. Wilde tells of a time when the humans and fairies fought a war. The humans kept digging up the fairies' home, eventually forcing the fairies to concede before they dumped salt on it and destroyed them forever. Many fairies, from leprechauns to powerful fae women, are captured by mere peasants, for humans often possess magic that can overcome the fairies. Iron, salt, certain herbs, and charms can all weaken the fairies greatly. This fear of humans might easily explain one of the reasons why the fairies were often so shy. It is obvious that the fairies do not like to be seen by humans, for although they live in every rock and every tree, they almost never appear to humans. Instead, it is within their nature to hide from mortals. Fairies often exhibited a sort of childish embarrassment, fueled by their extreme emotions, perhaps. They would act like shy and nervous children around adults, sometimes showing off, and sometimes running to hide. The times when fairies seek out humans are those times when the humans join them in the realm of in-between.